Hello, my name is Christy Westfall, and I'm so glad that you're here today to talk with me about cyber resilience and what that means and how to build a program around it. So let's go ahead and get started. Here we go. All right, so what are we going to talk about in this session? First, we're going to take a quiz. What? I know, yes, I'm making you take a test. Don't worry, it's not graded. Then we're going to take a pause and we're going to define what cyber resilience means, but we're going to do this together. So there is a Q&A live function going while you're listening to this. So please chime in at any point that you have feedback on what I'm talking about. But the quiz is also going to help put the whole problem of cyber resilience into context for all of us. Then we'll define together, we'll take that. Don't do this. These are areas where I could have done better, and I've had past mistakes that I would like to help you learn from. Then I have the do this, or at least consider doing this, my recommendations for you. And at the very end, I'll show you how to tackle this within your own organization right away, and then a little bit longer term as well. So before I go on and we take our quiz, I want to talk a little bit about why I chose this topic. I had the pleasure of being volunteered to do and own a cyber resilience program. It was a painful experience and I learned a lot from it. So I wanted to try and accomplish two things with this talk. Number one, I want to start a conversation about what a cyber resilience program really means and should be, and also to help others who also get volunteered into this situation. So with that, let me do a little bit more introduction here. So why am I here? I've been in information security for a very long time, and now I've really focused on leadership areas, but I've done a little bit of everything over my career. Security is painful all around, so I like to make sure that anything that I do where I can share my pain and better my experiences, I will. So that's one of these examples today. So let's share the knowledge and make it less painful all around. Oh, and I also put in random cat pictures, mostly for my amusement, but also to make sure that you are paying attention. All right. Oh, and random baby outer pictures too. So you'll see those as well. Okay, so let's take a quiz. Again, this won't be graded, but in order to put this cyber resilience concept into context, we'll run through some very public examples of situations that may or may not prove to be cyber resilient. You decide. So definitely leverage the Q&A in this situation. And you get extra bonus points if you get the reference of my title there. It's a very old kids show for those of you who may not know. Anyway, we are talking about Zoom. And what maybe you didn't know, other than, in my opinion, Zoom was kind of the hero of the whole pandemic, was that they also had at one point 500,000 passwords stolen. Yikes. And then they were subsequently offered up for sale. But what was even more interesting was how they got those passwords. So let me tell you a little bit about how this actually happened. The attackers that ended up with the credentials actually employed a credential stuffing attack that used multiple bots to avoid the same IP address being used for multiple Zoom accounts. And that was to prevent from being attacked or detected as a denial of service attack, because typically those of us who have been fortunate enough to experience a credential stuffing attack know it's loud and it's like a denial of service attack. So it's very easy to recognize. So this is a very low and slow way of doing that. They ended up employing a firm that helped them shut down thousands of websites that were attempting to trick users into downloading that malware or giving up their credentials. And they also were continuing, as this was going on, to investigate, lock accounts, and have users change their passwords. And then they were also, again, looking at some more technology to help control, future attacks. So the question here is, do you think that that's really a cyber resilient organization? They did recover quickly, so that may give us some clues into whether they're cyber resilient or not. But please chime in here. So how about this one? Have you ever heard of Finastra? I hadn't until I read this article, but they were hit by ransomware last year. This actually resulted in disrupted operations. They actually had to disconnect servers from the internet. And then as the story kind of came out, there were mixed messages on the true impact of what happened there. But there were rumors going around that they had to close offices and there were impact to North American customers while they cleaned up the situation. But the key interesting thing here is the attack went unnoticed for 3 days. This happened early in the pandemic. So there was a lot of, trying to get people to work from home and a lot of things going on. So, perfectly reasonable, unfortunately, that it happened like that. But it was a little bit tricky when they had to handle it. So in this situation, would you say they were cyber resilient or not, right? They had to close down, things for for while they cleaned up, and it was unnoticed for 3 days. So hold that thought, and we'll go through one more example here, one more test question. And this one, I think it kind of introduces itself. And yes, I know we're probably talking a lot about SolarWinds this year, and I love this diagram because it just kind of says it all. This was a super complicated attack, right? There were a lot of things going here. And by the way, this is from, you can see the link there from a FireEye blog entry that detailed what really happened. So from that perspective, it's really fascinating. But describing the true impact here, it could take years for us to really truly understand that. So it's kind of interesting that we have this example to look at here today. I have the link there. If you want the full slides, my email is at the very end of the deck. So please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to send you the slides with all my notes and all the links. So we all know what happened to SolarWinds. I'm not going to go into details, but would you say that is a cyber resilient situation or not? You decide. All right, so let's take just a brief moment and to try to define what cyber resilience is together. So is it testing controls? Is it disaster recovery of those controls? I found this definition and I really like it because it's so simple and it's so understandable. When I was handed the program, the definition was already given for me. So it was a little bit difficult to dig out from underneath that. And it had to do with a little bit of those concepts I talk about in those first 2 bullets. But this definition really drives it home for me. Cyber resilience refers to the system's ability to recover or regenerate its performance after a cyber attack produces a degradation of its performance. Boom, right? Very simple. And where I got this particular quote was from a chapter on resilience. And they mentioned too that resilience is often confused with other concepts that are related but different, like risk, robustness, and security. And that's what I kept running into. So I thought this was very appropriate for this slide. Resilience is really a different concept. It defines the capacity to recover. It's defined as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, period, right? And so that can mean a lot of important things and nuances as you kind of go down this path a little bit. I really love this diagram because it's so, simply shows what resiliency in general means, right? It's about sustaining an impactful event or the end of the right of boom, as we like to say. But it's also about the left of boom. It's preparation, things you can do ahead of time to be ready for that. And a lot of it is really truly like our friend SpongeBob here. It's absorbing that attack and being able to recover from that quickly. So I think some of these references really, again, put it into context pretty clearly. I wish I had some of these wonderful references that I found for this particular talk when I was doing the program, because it really would have helped me at the time. So I was excited to find these. This one in particular, when you start to think about it, resiliency truly just adds other dimensions to your typical security control set. Notice here specifically the emphasis on the left of boom, the cyber resiliency, but also this notion of continuity of operations. This shouldn't be rocket science, which kind of was amazing to me, but depending on your organization, this may be new concepts for them. Also, this should be a huge relief to those who understand this is not a siloed effort, right? And it helps with the ownership argument that we're going to talk about in a later slide. So we have a little bit of that, and now we have a lot of this. Now we can sprinkle in a framework. Now we start getting some more detailed formality to begin your planning journey. Once you get that definition of resiliency down, you start moving towards that conversation of, okay, do we have what we consider to be a part of this program already somewhere else? Because no doubt you have pieces of this, but it may not be organized into a cyber resiliency program yet. You start setting your objectives that fall under the categories that are in the figure here, in the middle in the purple. And then you start matching those up with the techniques. What do you already have in your organization? And then you start, figuring out what should we be using. And once that exercise is complete, you'll have a beginning roadmap that you'll flesh out with more pieces that we'll talk about in the next slides. Consider this piece, though, your gap assessment. So one note here, you should not be doing this in a vacuum. I'm going to say that several times to really drive that home. This should be some sort of governance structure in place where the collaboration happens between your security organization, externally as well, though, roping in folks like technology, development, leadership, continuity, and risk. I prefer to sketch out my recommendations first and then try to socialize them, especially when I'm working on something new to the organization, because then you have a solid kind of grounding of what your message should be, and we'll talk about that too. But you want to make sure you have that all in place before you start trying to get others on board. And then before I leave this slide, I want to give an example of what you may already have in place that you might want to consider for this overall program. Do you already do tabletop testing for cyber topics? I bet you do. That'll definitely fit in here. What about disaster recovery testing? Probably so, right? I would hope at some level you've got that, whatever size organization you are. The trick will be in weaving all these together, but hold that thought and we'll get there, and I'll show you how to do that. All right. This model is gold, which is why it chokes me up. I'm a little sarcastic, as you can tell. If you can take these techniques that you decided upon during your gap assessment and leverage this to map them to the cyber kill chain, then you're starting to get to kind of that weaving that I was talking about. Then you start plugging in your security controls, like your intrusion detection system, your endpoint detection and response, your EDR tool, antivirus, or your SIM. And then you're going to start quickly seeing where your holes are, right? You're going to see, where do my controls cover things from not only the kill chain perspective, but also from the resiliency perspective. Then the discussion goes to, do we want to fill those holes? Do we accept that risk? How do we fill them if you want to, and so on, right? This is all about building up the details you'll need to justify your entire effort. And also, while you're doing this, don't forget, leverage that gap assessment, because that's going to help guide you as you start doing this mapping. All right, so let's take another pause and talk about sustainability. This concept was kind of the bane of my existence while I was trying to build a program that didn't have organizational support. So, but it's really important. I want to talk about it here because, what does that really mean? It is kind of be more organic in your planning, because you're going to need to build into a component into your program that lives year after year, right? You're not going to just be one and done. It means planning. It means organizational support. It means working on a maturity level goal. But ultimately, it's evidence that this program will continue and will help both the left and right of boom, even as the organization shifts and grows. So let's take an example. Do you want maybe a 2-year planning of all the pieces that you end up with, like exercises, reviews, functional exercises, along with the personnel who are going to support these efforts? And I say 2 years because I find in our space, it's very difficult to plan further out than that. So I think 2 years is a nice medium that you can start showing repeatability. This reflects thought and evidence, once you have that, that the organization will continue the program on an ongoing basis, which is a good thing. And we'll show why here in a few. All right, so don't do these things. I highly recommend you don't. Don't piecemeal the program. When I say piecemeal, I mean that you shouldn't cobble together a bunch of unrelated things with no gap assessment and call that your program. You need a gap assessment because otherwise you may be just, again, checking the box and not truly performing or putting together a program that will help the organization, which really should be the entire goal for this. And that, depending on how you scope it ultimately, but the key is to have a supported specific program that is not the partial responsibility of just one person, unless the scope is that small where it is sustainable. And it's just really going to depend. The key here is to take some of the steps in the next section of this talk and then properly define that program, understand what gaps exist, and then put together a remediation plan. This can be a temporary assignment for a person or a team to define, but operational resources are going to be needed to support it. So for example, if you find that you have all the pieces already available in other parts of your organization, and you just need to monitor what they do and collect that evidence, kind of like an audit, this may be a quarter of a resource on an annual basis. However, if you realize that you're missing a large chunk of the requirements, then that may be 1 to 2 dedicated resources to execute the implementation and maintain it directly. So that's a little bit on resourcing. Let's talk about length of implementation. It's going to also depend on your scope of your effort and the level of gaps you have. This should be driven based on risk and shouldn't be considered that one and done effort, going back to that sustainability. This should be built in, and I recommend incrementally. Don't say, you've got to do the kitchen sink all at once, because that never works. You want to do it incrementally to existing efforts and mature it over time. This will help alleviate that Chicken Little approach, where you claim that you need an army, when really you may just need a part of a dedicated soldier. And one more thing on this tooling. I'm not a big fan of making it all about the tool, but I'm more focused on the information. So if you're in a large organization with a lot of moving parts, something more sophisticated than a spreadsheet might be warranted. But honestly, I don't think there's a specific tool for this work that you can, you have to largely create it on your own based on your requirements. The key is to support your investment, whatever you do. And make sure that you can tell that story. There are freely available tools from sources like CISA, but you likely can leverage your own disaster recovery and business continuity tools. They may just take some additional tweaking, or maybe you can kind of wedge the cyber requirements in there for tracking. The testing piece may not warrant a tool, or it could be leveraged with something as simple as a SharePoint site. So those are just some ideas. On the failure to obtain leadership support side, this is going to come through your messaging, which is going to be the branding effort I'm going to talk about here in a few slides. So keep that in mind. And then again, don't make this a cyber-only problem, and don't forget that this should be risk-based. So let's consider some things to do instead. And I love this as well, because this really says it all in regards to ownership, right? It's a combined effort, right? Whenever the word cyber is used in anything, the security team gets pointed at and say, you own this, right? So not so in this case, because again, this effort is really woven into the overall organization and not just owned by cyber, even if cyber has a large stake in it. Cyber may not have the business or technology expertise to flesh out the pieces needed in the business continuity plan, so a partnership is needed. So then who's accountable? My opinion is that the business continuity team is, because again, they kind of own that larger effort, and that cyber is just one aspect of it. Does that mean business continuity owns the cyber resiliency program? Not necessarily, but they might. Cyber is most certainly responsible for their own controls and testing those security controls, but my view is that those pieces roll up to the larger business continuity plans. All right, so here's my favorite slide, the brand, right? So you've got this program scope, You know who owns what. Now what do? You come up with a slogan and a website. Kidding, sort of. You don't need to be fancy, but you do need a consistent message supported by facts and not fear. When I say don't dilute the message, that's what I'm referring to when, you're getting cutesy with, say, cat pictures. That detracts from the real message. You don't want to get too cutesy in this case. So let's go over some messaging tips. Tie this back to a regulatory or some compliance efforts, and then you've got a whole lot of support. If you're in a highly regulated organization, you'll be tasked by regulators for this information sooner or later. Auditors, whether they're internal or third party, will also start to ask about this as the concept catches on more and more, because trust me, cyber resilience is becoming quite the thing. A really helpful technique that I like to employ are diagrams that tie back to frameworks. So you could use NIST, cybersecurity framework, or simply mapping to your existing internal controls framework. That includes tools. And when I say that again, you plug that in. What tools do you have to cover what pieces of your framework, and then start there. I also recommend a trick where you can take applicable threats to your organization and map those to your security controls. And I use controls and security tools kind of interchangeably here. That helps you determine the cyber gaps, and then you can start exploring and testing these through the DR plans of the organization to see how the cyber attacks impact technology recovery. Essentially, the DR plan should be all-encompassing and not operational or cyber-specific in nature. So we'll talk about how to get that resourcing number in a moment, but make sure that that is part of your branding effort. Whatever your estimate is may not be perfect, but make sure you are comfortable supporting whatever degree of effort whatever degree of army that you're after. You may also try to get creative here. One thought is, if this looks something like very large and complex and going to take a lot of resources, then perhaps suggest repurposing existing resources temporarily to get certain chunks up and running, and then put them back full time once that piece is done. So for example, if a key gap ends up being that there's no control testing, but you have staff that already do this in other areas of your organization, borrow them for a while, right? Or periodically, and do the testing. And I'll talk about one example here as we go. So let's talk about resourcing. This all ties back to the scope of your program, right? You definitely want to leverage that gap assessment to show the scope. If you find that you need only a few things done to shore it up, this may be a part-time person over time. If you find major holes, you may need a project manager or other volunteer to organize and drive that implementation. You may need dedicated engineers to implement those controls, and you may need a penetration type person to test them. And you may need that disaster recovery and business continuity resource to help do a broader test of system recovery and deploy the business continuity plan. One resource thing to keep in mind, you will need business folks not involved directly in the program to participate periodically at some level. This just means that when you do tabletops, you will have to have business operations, leadership, human resources, legal, and other non-technology folks to really talk through how to respond. Because again, this is definitely a collaboration effort. And you definitely want to also include these ideas in your branding effort, as I mentioned before, so that you can get support for it. All right, so now you got all this stuff. What exactly are you implementing? Your implementation/remediation plan might include some or all of the following. You definitely want to have some sort of selling of the plan, some sort of communication plan across your organization, should you include getting, and which should include getting management buy-in. That's definitely key. You want to design a test plan to take into account what's on the slide. And you want to do testing both functional and tabletop. I think I've glossed on functional testing just a little bit, but I want to make sure we understand what that means. That means actually testing the controls that they work under a cyber attack, so to speak. And so that means getting in there and testing them. And I'll talk about, I mentioned a penetration testing type resource on the last slide. We'll get there in just a second, though, on why that can be important and helpful. You want to include also making sure you include everything here on the slide in that test plan, including what kind of operational risks are you trying to cover. You want critical assets and those interconnections, because this is where you're actually starting to weave it into disaster recovery. You want to make sure you try to attack or touch on critical asset operation during this, because that's really where it's going to show value to your organization. And I talked about communication, but you also want some level of training. You're going to want teams trained well that are a part of this program so that they understand that they're a part of the program, what their expectations are. And then you have to also balance that with not having too much going on with the program and overburdening resources. But again, you want people to understand their roles should something of this large nature happen. And then one other thing, you want to make sure well, two other things. You want to make sure you have control gap remediation planned for as a milestone, and that could be involving finding a tool or a solution, implementation of that, and testing it. And that takes time, right? That does not happen overnight. And then ongoing evidence capture is also very critical, because we don't often consider that as we plan for resourcing, but it takes a lot of time. So make sure that that is also included in your resource planning or in your implementation plan. So how to measure? Everybody's favorite topic. Metrics are always a difficult thing. Here are some suggestions, and of course, they make it sound so easy, dashboards, right? These are some general ideas. I would also like to point out that the NIST documents also have extensive suggestions on metrics, so you might want to dig through those a bit. But let's talk about some ones you might not have considered for this specific effort. What about security incident metrics? Those might help bolster your cyber resilience program. What about metrics for your actual tabletop exercises or other functional exercises? Are there any lessons learned that you are tracking, right? That shows continuous improvement and sustainability that we mentioned earlier. What about tracking the efforts for remediation of your gap assessment? Improving your, just overall project tracking. Improving your resiliency by closing those gaps in those controls is a great thing to show. And then metrics on the effectiveness of your control testing via penetration testing, which I'll get to on the next slide. You can even do some before and after metrics. So before an exercise, take a survey of your participants and say, where do you expect gaps to be? And then afterwards, did we hit on those expected gaps? Did we find other gaps? Those kinds of things. So you can have some qualitative metrics there. All right, how can penetration testing save the day? You want to test your controls under duress, right? But you want to do so as safely as possible. And it also helps support that purple team approach that everybody wants to do. And sometimes you need that extra support because not just because it's the right thing to do and it helps, but this is a good excuse to help kind of tie that in there. So how would you scope these exercises? I'm going to leverage that applicable threats that I mentioned earlier. Again, if you know what applicable threats that you're worried about for the organization, and they can be very high level, from insider threat to cyber criminal, and what are they after in your organization? Map those to MITRE, and then you build scenarios based on where you think your controls cover them and see if they work. Do they, can you track lateral movement? The ultimate question for many organizations. So let's take phishing, because everybody has phishing apply to them, right? Phishing, what do you want to test that in prod? Absolutely. Why not? Have a malicious appearing yet harmless email crafted by a professional and send it to some of your employees. This would actually cover several controls along the way, including your email gateway solution, your security awareness program, your endpoint, your EDR solution, or maybe even antivirus. And then your outbound proxy, and maybe some others that I haven't thought of. Then you cycle through these tests and your threats until you hit all your controls, and you see what gaps you have, and you continue to build your testing program based on this. One that I do suggest that's also pretty applicable to many organizations that you probably don't want to test in production unless you have to. At some level, your DDoS, your distributed denial of service attack controls. You hope you don't have to test that in real life, but sometimes it just happens. So, or there may be other ways you can test that without completely trying to denial of service your organization. But it is important to make sure it works at some level. Okay, next steps. Now that I've done this massive brain dump on cyber resilience, let's take a look at what you can do now and in the next 90 days and beyond. So, what to do in 30 days? I have a ton of resources in the resources coming up slides. That's not light reading. Do some reading, get some ideas on how to, kind of nuance what I've suggested here for your organization, whatever's going to work. Assess the risks, right? You're going to need to make sure that this is risk-based, because you're going to find a lot of gaps as you go along. Everybody does. It's okay, but you can't do everything all at once. So prioritize based on what's going to have the largest impact to your organization if not remediated. Make sure you assign that ownership and the accountability as clearly as possible. If cyber ends up with it, I'm sorry, but at least we're working on it, and hopefully you're building that partnership so that you're not trying to do it alone. Outline the structure. That's going to include your plan for socialization, collaboration, leveraging many teams' resources. Again, not to be done on your own. And then get going, right? It's one of those things, just do it, right? Because that's really important to just get started on it. And then in 90 days, what do you start doing? You've got all these pieces and parts together. Start getting support from your leadership. If you don't do this, you're going to struggle, and your program's probably not going to go very far. So get that support, socialize, and collaborate. This is a team effort. Don't forget to leverage that and make it a team effort. Plan and do your first test. Just do one, tabletop or functional. That may help not only get support for your plan, but it's also going to probably have things to be built into your implementation plan. And then follow up on those test results. Every test you do should have some follow-up and should be ensured that those things are remediated, because otherwise, why do you do tests? You shouldn't do them. And then lather, rinse, repeat. You have to keep doing this, and you do really need to do functional testing. You need to make sure your controls are working as expected in all capacities, right? Because everybody says, oh, we have this great coverage. Well, great. Have you ever tested it? This is a way to do it. All right. So that's your plan. Here's some resources. Here are some more resources. And again, they're all in the slides. If you want the notes, you'll have to contact me direct. And there is where you do it. So, I really enjoyed putting this together. I really appreciate the concepts of cyber resilience, even though they were kind of introduced to me at a painful level. I do appreciate it. And it makes sense. Again, not rocket science. I hope that you found the topics that I covered here useful, and I wish you much success in your cyber resilience efforts. So thank you.